Hi there, welcome. Very pleased today to be hosting a panel with TheFutureEconomy.ca entitled Sustainable Food Systems, Canada as a World Leader in Agricultural Sustainability. My name is Rob Annan. I'm President and CEO of Genome Canada, and I will be the host for today's panel. First, I'd like to begin the event with a territorial acknowledgement, both as a reminder and a call to action for ourselves and others. I'm recording from the town we call Toronto. We're coming to you from various places across Canada, and the land that I'm on is home to many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I want to recognize both past and ongoing injustices perpetrated against Indigenous peoples as part of the colonial project in Canada, including violence, suppression, land theft, and harmful attempts to erase culture. Today, we're going to be talking about sustainable agriculture, a subject that is very close to our hearts at Genome Canada. We are a national, federally funded, not-for-profit organization who works in partnership with provinces, industry, and civil society across sectors, including health, natural resources, and in agriculture, where we invest in and coordinate large-scale genomics research projects, innovation projects, focusing on research, data, and talent to generate solutions to today's biggest challenges. We have a 20-year history of funding genomic research in Canada, and we work with an enterprise of genome centers and researchers across the country. Today, we're going to be discussing how best we can leverage the power of genomics to further the development of sustainable food systems in Canada. To become a world leader in this space, we'll have a discussion around the role of different stakeholders in making that happen. I'm particularly interested and excited about the topic as Genome Canada has funded a number of world-leading projects in this space. In fact, we're one of the only countries in the world where we are using the power and promise of genomics to address not just human health, but the same sorts of platforms and facilities being leveraged to also support work in agriculture, natural resources, and in many of the issues facing us with the climate crisis. We have and are currently supporting several investments in this area, including Genome Canada's recently launched $30 million initiative to reduce the carbon footprint and support economic growth of Canadian agriculture and food systems. Now, before we jump into the conversation, I want to take a moment to introduce our panelists, who are experts, researchers, and leaders funded through Genome Canada in various ways. First, I'd like to introduce François Belzile, professor in the Plant Science Department at Université Laval. Working in close cooperation with plant breeders, his lab is developing new molecular genetics and genomic tools in order to grow new crop varieties with desirable traits such as greater resistance to pests. This research has already led to the marketing in Quebec and the Atlantic provinces of several new varieties of barley and a brand new line of soy crops that are highly tolerant to the plant disease sclerotinia. His research has contributed to the development of expertise and leadership in plant genotyping and has served as the foundation for the SoyaGen project. Dr. Belzile is funded through Genome Canada on several projects looking to improve yield and disease resistance in short-season soybean and in developing tools to support breeders in choosing the most promising crosses to develop high-yield, early maturity varieties in less time and at a reduced cost. Welcome, François.
Thank you.
Next, we have Ellen Goddard, professor at the Faculty of Agricultural, Life, and Environmental Sciences at the University of Alberta. Over the past 30 years, Professor Goddard's research has been focused on agricultural economics, exploring domestic and international markets for food products, particularly meat and livestock, for policy analysis purposes. Her current research includes various aspects of food marketing, including consumer response to food safety incidents, consumer interest in labels, traceability and certification, and public response to the introduction of new technologies in agriculture. Dr. Goddard is a lead GELS researcher on 6 livestock genomics projects funded by Genome Canada, including work on animal disease resilience and feed efficiency. Her research is focused on exploring and understanding policies and management techniques within the food supply chain. Welcome, Ellen. Finally, we have Chris Grainger, President and CEO of Harvest Genomics. He has a personal connection to the agricultural industry, starting with his upbringing in rural Ontario, where he spent summers up at his grandparents' farms. This would eventually lead to completing his BSc in managing the Plant Genomics Lab in the Department of Plant Agriculture at the University of Guelph. This was followed by an MSc in plant breeding genetics before founding Harvest Genomics, where the company provides genetic services for the agricultural sector. Welcome, Chris. All right, with the introductions out of the way, let's jump right into the questions. First question and the topic for today, Chris, I'll ask you to kick us off. What are sustainable food systems?
Great. Thank you, Rob. And first of all, I'd like to say it's a real pleasure to be here today and to be a part of this panel and discussing this very important topic. This question is very topical, given the recent impact of inflation on food prices here in Canada, which all Canadians are facing right now in that challenge. So defining sustainable food systems is really about the interplay between different areas within the food production system. Generally speaking, those main components or areas of a sustainable food system are, first of all, environmental impact of the food production itself, whether that be land resource management or the carbon footprint related to greenhouse gas emissions. Second, mitigating the threats to the health of plants and animals that make up our food supply. And third, the economics of producing food, whether that's the logistics of transporting our food supply throughout the country or ensuring that we have profitability for farmers and food producers, because ensuring sustainable farming operations is critical to sustainable food systems here in Canada.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. Ellen, maybe I'll turn to you. Perhaps you want to build on Chris's definition around sustainable food systems, but perhaps you could also flag why you think they're important for our health, economy, environment, and more.
Thanks very much. I'd also like to thank you for having me at this opportunity. I think the simplest thing is our life depends on safe, nutritious food. And that's everybody's life on the planet. So sustainable agriculture is critical for sustaining life in the future. As far as the economic impact of this goes, in some senses, the agri-food sector in Canada seems small, perhaps, to some people. It employs about 2.1 million people and represents about 7% of gross domestic product. But one of the big things is everybody in Canada eats. And on average, we only spend about 10% of our disposable income on food, putting us in very elite company worldwide, where in some countries people spend 50 to 60% of their disposable income on food. So should agriculture and the agri-food system not be sustainable in the future, the costs of food are going to go up. Imports are probably going to go up. A variety of environmental degradation may happen, all of which will incur additional costs for Canadian society. So it's critical that we maintain this sector as sustainable into the future, particularly when you think about the amount of land that is devoted in the country, arable land, to farming level agricultural production, and the rest of the economic spin-offs through the rest of the food supply chain.
Excellent. Thanks, Ellen. François, I'll turn to you, and maybe you can elaborate on the opening remarks there from both Chris and Ellen, and about kind of sustainable food systems, why they matter. But maybe you could also perhaps talk a little bit about, what are Canada's food systems currently like? What are maybe our strengths, but also more importantly, where are the vulnerabilities?
Yes, thanks, Rob. It's not often that we're asked such broad questions. We oftentimes are constrained to more technical topics, whereas this is more far-reaching. I think one of the things, contrary to what a lot of people may have in mind in terms of what's a farm and what's farm life like, we're a very far cry from a century ago where subsistence farming was a very predominant thing. Now farming is a business. And food production is on a large scale, highly specialized operations, revenue driven. So, everything needs to be considered in terms of its profitability and sustainability, obviously in the long term, interconnected with world markets. We've seen what happened last winter with the situation in Ukraine. Everything in the farm system gets affected by energy prices, access to markets, and all of that. So it's a very modern and very highly specialized type of food system. And some of the vulnerabilities that come with that obviously are because it's so interconnected with world markets. And so a lot of the crops, and even some of the livestock that are being raised in Canada are meant for export markets. And that's a tremendous opportunity. It's something that brings a lot to the Canadian economy. And I think that our producers are very good at meeting that international demand. But one of the vulnerabilities is that, sometimes there are some, limitations or restrictions that are imposed by some countries that, for whatever internal reasons, wish to favor their own producers. And so that's always an issue. We've seen cases I think in the pork industry, in canola, where some countries have raised some import duties, so to, again, favor local economies. Another important factor is just climate. And so obviously, certainly in the crop area, where we're much more highly dependent on the weather and climatic factors than maybe indoor animal raising, which is maybe a bit insulated from that. We're certainly very, very much affected by, rainfall, heat, drought, all these aspects that are interconnected. And it's something that obviously has a tremendous potential to impact producers' capacity to meet world market needs. And so I think those are some important vulnerabilities going forward.
Yeah, so those are some big subjects, as you say, broad questions, broad challenges. If we think about global economics, geopolitics, climate, technology, and so on, there's a lot to unpack here in the next 45 minutes or so. But why don't we'll focus in, you talked a little bit off the top about, kind of the modern nature of the agricultural business, as it were. And I admit, as somebody who grew up in an industrial town in Canada rather than a farming town, I had very outdated notions of the farmer on the tractor with their thumb in the soil and so on. And when I first visited a modern farm, I was really struck by the amount of science and research really being put to use right there in the field. I wonder if we could maybe just spend a moment there on some of that technology and unpack a little bit about the role that genomics can play in helping us address some of the challenges that, François, you've outlined there, and maybe some of the solutions. So what we see, for instance, in genomics now, Chris, maybe I'll turn to you first. Given the business that you're in there, could you talk a little bit about kind of the role genomics is playing in agricultural systems?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I like to define it in two categories. You have genomics for food production, and you have genomics for food safety. So, when we talk about food production, specifically within the realm of, crop breeding, animal breeding, and all those amazing technologies that have come on the scene in the last decade or so, I'm just old enough to be part of the Sanger sequencing era and what that was all about. And so having all these next generation technologies come online has really been, game changing and such a tremendous shift in how we, not only produce genetic or genomic data, but how we integrate it. And of course, alongside that is the other side, which is the computational resources that are available now. And, it's one thing to produce a sea of genomic data. It's quite another to make sense of that and distill that down into the parts that are most impactful, whether it is in crop development or in food safety. And then if we switch to the food safety side of things, I think we're in a tremendous era again with DNA sequencing technologies becoming the norm, in the sense that it does create that common language, if you will, the language of ATGC, and therefore you can create very standardized methods of testing to ensure that, no matter what part of the food chain you're involved in, whether you're a primary producer, processor, consumer, you may want to track and trace different pathogens or pests. And if we have these sort of universal testing technologies, we can do a much better job of identifying these risks and then moving on those risks and making those, let's say, integrative pest management decisions that need to be made to keep the food system healthy.
That's excellent. Thanks a lot, Chris. François, maybe I'll turn to you for some perspectives on some of the genomic technologies and applications that you're seeing, both what we're doing today, but also perhaps what you see coming down the pipe when it comes to genomics and food systems.
Right. So I think right now one of the areas where we're having a really important impact is gearing or selecting the right crop variety for the right environment, and I'll try to use a fairly concrete example. So in some of the work that we've done as a team, we've been developing tools that are able to inform farmers about the presence of a specific type of a pathogen, so a fungal agent that's in the soil. And when it's there, it causes disease and it lowers yield and therefore decreases the profitability. And so we've been able to develop tools that informs the farmer what specific variant of that pathogen is there. So we know that with COVID, for example, we have different variants. And similarly, for any sort of pathogen, there are multiple variants of these pathogens. And we have disease resistance genes in soybean, but they can only provide protection against certain variants, a bit like a vaccine can be only specific for certain types of viruses. And so what we're able to do then using genomic tools that we've developed is to correctly identify what specific type of pathogen is there. And then that helps the breeders design crops that have the proper resistance mechanism to overcome that specific agent. And so by that way, we're able, for no additional cost, just through information, be able to provide farmers with an easy means to overcome disease pressures and not have to rely on things like fungicides, for example, to achieve that same goal.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thanks, François. Ellen, maybe I'll turn to you now, and especially given your perspective, kind of coming at this from an economics perspective, in terms of maybe kind of implementation and what you're actually seeing in terms of what's happening in in the systems now. Where do you see solutions either being implemented or that will be implemented that involve genomics technologies in the food system?
Strangely enough, what I thought about saying is going to sound very similar to Chris and François in some ways, because I guess I see one of the big vulnerabilities is in the area of plant and animal disease and how we need to be addressing that. So examples of things that I see that are going to be potentially important are how we deal with the faster coming challenges around plant and animal disease when we're in an integrated global market and these things leap species. So for example, all the debate around COVID, did it come from bats? Did it come from other sorts of animals? And how do we control these things? We also have choices in the genomic tools that we use to treat things. So there's a great project that some colleagues in the US worked on in citrus greening in the orange industry, where they were looking at perhaps using gene editing to treat insects versus gene editing to treat the orange trees, and trying to figure out which of those would be the best strategy to deal with the problem of citrus greening in the orange industry. So BEST has economic components to it, which is going to be the least costly, which is going to be the most effective. But it also has broader challenges in terms of what's acceptable to society and where we can go. But the fact that genomics is giving us these choices, I think, means that we're going to be more agile in responding to challenges of plant and animal disease. And I think we can't overestimate that too much in terms of making sure the public understands this particular role for genomics. It's really exciting.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. That's great. And I think, I certainly am struck by, your comments around the kind of the intersection of, kind of like human health and transmission of viruses with COVID, animals, and so on. I'm struck by the kind of the One Health concept as we think about the relationship between agriculture, human health, and the environment. And certainly I know at Genome Canada, we have a variety of projects on the go now that are really looking to sort of stop thinking about these things in isolation, but rather to be thinking about them in a more holistic and integrated way. So really appreciate that. So then to move from kind of what we're thinking about there with regards to these, the technologies and where we see them being deployed and so on, it's clear that we're going to need a multisectoral approach. I wonder if we could unpack for a minute kind of the different roles that, different entities can play. And I'm thinking here government versus say academic research versus industry. Kind of what roles can each of those be playing? What maybe are we missing a little bit? What suggestions do we have for those players in terms of tackling some of the pressing issues in our food systems? And maybe are there good examples where we're seeing collaboration across those different sectors? I'm not sure who might want to kick off on this. I'll open the floor to anyone if they want to maybe tackle this concept of multisectoral approaches.
I could go ahead on that if you want.
Great. Thanks,
So I think that there are different incentives for different types of research goals. So I think a lot of the research that we have now, that's collaboration with private sectors, actors, those are, I think, in my view, going very well in the sense that there's incentive on all parts to sort of collaborate and achieve a sort of common goal. And oftentimes these sorts of research projects are focused on outcomes that will allow industry to recoup their investment through some mechanism, whether it's selling better or more seed and things like that. I think where I see maybe a bit of a lack is in what I would call public good research, where is nothing that comes out of it that's necessarily going to benefit a specific actor in the system, but that overall will bring benefits. For example, if you're looking into how you can mix different crops on a farm to get diversification and things like that, no direct actor is going to necessarily recoup the cost of that. But I think there's a good role for government to favor this sort of broader research that is less easy to monetize, but that does have its importance in terms of ensuring sustainable farms that nurture soil health and reduce disease pressure and all that, but that may come at a cost that you can't expect industry to be necessarily focused on addressing those needs.
Yeah, thanks, François. That's a great perspective. Ellen, maybe I'll turn to you maybe to pick up on this in terms of that gap that François identified around kind of public good research. Do you see other maybe you see some other strengths in the kind of academic research ecosystem, but gaps like that as well?
Historically, remember, agricultural research has always had a strong element of public funding in it because it was always believed that the key players in the agri-food system would underinvest in research that would have broader public good aspects in terms of prices and costs of food for different players globally. So, but that trend has shifted in the last 20 years so that there is sort of a withdrawing from growth in public spending on agricultural research versus private spending on agricultural research, which may leave holes in terms of some of the things that get adopted. I was thinking back to an example of something like a vaccine for E. coli that was developed for cattle in a time when it seemed incredibly topical. We were having a crisis around E. coli at one point in the livestock industry, but ultimately that particular vaccine was not widely adopted. And I don't think it's in commercial production now, but I could be wrong about that. But even if we develop things that have public good aspects, like the entire community would benefit from reduced E. coli in terms of livestock production, it's not necessary that it's going to be adopted widely commercially. And we have to understand there may be gaps in how that process operates. Maybe farmers found the vaccine incredibly expensive. Maybe retailers and processors figured they had other ways of ensuring safety in the system, and they didn't need to prove that cattle were vaccinated to convince the public that the product was safe. So in that case, are we better off or worse off without that vaccine in commercial use? Those kind of decisions clearly require collaboration across industry and government, and clearly scientists, because they're only going to do research in things that they find critical and they can justify in lots of ways. But I would also say we cannot leave the public out of this debate. I think we should always develop research priorities, including the public, which is something we've traditionally not done as well as we might have. And sometimes as a result, we get a backlash after the fact. But we can include the public in some ways or other more directly at the beginning to ensure their priorities in terms of sustainable food systems are being met, and also to provide a broader understanding of what some of the significant challenges are that may make the public more accepting of trade-offs in the types of technologies we use.
That's excellent. Thanks, Ellen. That's a really great example and a great answer. Chris, I'll turn to you, and maybe you want to build off of Ellen's comments and François, but maybe you also, especially given your role at Harvest Genomics, talk a little bit about, maybe some of the challenges that you see from the industry side, particularly when it comes to bringing new technologies to market or what have you.
One thing that I'll add a little differently is the streamlining of funding, where you have, let's say, discovery and development happen at the public institutions, and then that natural segue of, well, how do you get that out of the manuscript, so to speak, and bring that into commercialization and bringing that to the forefront within different economies, when you're not only dealing with national competition, but obviously international and global competition in very fiercely competitive spaces, whether that's agriculture or life science. And so, we can't just kind of put on the horse blinders and try to work within Canada as a silo. We need to acknowledge, the broader global, competitive landscape, whether that's the genomic technologies or industry. And one thing that I think we need to do is to enhance our entrepreneurial ecosystem within Canada, within this space. And actually, I'll point to that recent BioCreate program that was just announced for here in Southwestern Ontario. I think that's a wonderful, next leap into fostering not only the innovation, but then commercializing that innovation that has been developed over the last 20 years of Genome Canada funding.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks, Chris. And that BioCreate program and our colleagues here at Ontario Genomics, I think it's a valuable addition for sure. Maybe I'll pick up just briefly on this question. You just touched, Chris, on kind of I'm thinking here about the policy landscape. So thinking about initiatives and programs that help provide that link from research to commercialization in that innovation space. Ellen spoke pretty eloquently about the need for public funding of agricultural research. Are there other policies that you think are important to support sustainable agriculture and food systems that we could be looking at? Maybe François, I'll look over at you to see if there's anything other than what we've already added there.
Well, I think people respond to signals, and so obviously, if you put in place policies and incentives that reward certain types of behaviors and management practices, growers are going to respond to those. And they, I guess, could come in different forms. And being more of a crop genomicist, it's not my area of expertise, but I can imagine anything that has to do with, ensuring that there's proper regulation in terms of how farmers gain access to different products that can be used on the farm, pesticides and other, that, there's some good framework for that. Same thing for any sort of greenhouse gas related question.
Yeah, excellent. Ellen, I assume as an economist, it warms your heart to hear a plant geneticist talk about responding to incentives. Anything you would add here around other policy considerations we should have?
I was just going to say that incentives have in lots of cases worked far better than regulation. And so the combination of regulation and incentive has to be sort of predicated on the specific issue you're trying to resolve. So unfortunately, it won't be a one fix for every issue we face in sustainability. I guess we also need to understand all the different agendas along a supply chain that goes from the farm to a final consumer. And there's all of the sorts of stuff about making sure that we understand what the, say, environmental footprint, the carbon footprint, other sorts of footprints associated with food production actually are. At the moment, we're comparing often in debates about sustainability what happens on the farm. So even in a comparison, for example, between cow's milk and oat milk, we're looking at how sustainable production is at the farm level, but we know little about the modifications that happen at the processing level, maybe even the need to add protein to a plant-based product to make it nutritionally equivalent to an animal-based product. For example, there's lots of questions that we still have that are making the picture of what's more sustainable. So I really hope that things like labeling and measuring and establishing standards and all of those kinds of things are part of our policy rubric to enhance our understanding of these things, both for the public and consumers or non-consumers.
Yeah, super interesting. I want to pick up on some of that. But Chris, anything else from you on the policy side?
Yeah, I just want to touch a little bit on the regulatory, and it's always important that we realize that we have different regulatory frameworks, whether we're talking national or international. And I guess I'll zero in on gene editing as a great technology in that space. And we might have a wonderful regulatory network here in Canada with plants with novel traits or PNT system. But what does that mean? We want to export our commodities into other countries that might not have that same regulatory space. So it's one of those issues where you have to somehow disentangle the science or the technology versus the public policy or perception of a given technology. And I think that is still a major challenge. I would say that most, the average person in public, when they hear genomic technologies in agriculture, they instantly zero in onto GMO, which is still a polarizing topic of discussion in society. So I think there's that aspect of regulatory that we have to always be mindful of when we're setting different agendas and policies.
Yeah, that's great, Chris, and it really does. That's in effect, you've kind of pointed the way to what I wanted to pick up from Ellen's comments as well, which is kind of the perspective of the public, of the consumer, for a lot of the new, whether it's processes and technologies and so on. I want to get a sense from each of you, in terms of how well you think the public sort of understands genomics and the role that they play within kind of existing food systems and the potential for the future. And then, maybe what some ideas of what we can do to sort of increase perhaps, the literacy around these issues. So maybe François, maybe I'll turn to you to kick this off.
Yeah, I think one of the great challenges is that, the within the Canadian population, there's such a small fraction that is actively engaged in food production. 99% of people are consumers, basically. And so there's a real disconnect between, the grocery shopping person and the person on the farm doing production. And I'm always sad to see that most often when these issues do come to the front and center in media, it usually revolves around some issue. There's a problem, there's something to be afraid of, or something to be concerned about, or farmers are blamed for their cows belching methane into the environment, things like that. And so it's really challenging, in my view, to get to be heard in terms of having something to say, and then be able to have a venue in which to sort of give examples how these things are changing and what sort of positive changes are occurring. So I think that it's going to be a long-standing challenge to get these issues across, and they can tend to be very technologically heavy and not always easy to communicate effectively to the public. And so in a very polarized system, like Chris was saying, it's not always easy to get that across.
Yeah, absolutely. Ellen, what do you think about kind of the role of kind of the public perception in genomics?
Well, having spent 10 years doing research on exactly that issue in different contexts, it's really far more nuanced than we actually think. I don't think the public at large, by the way, is avoiding even GMOs in Canada. If I ask people on a survey, which I've been doing since 2000 perhaps, regularly, would you consume genetically modified fruits and vegetables? Almost 60% of the population says yes. 80% of the population says, would you consume a product that has genetically modified ingredients such as margarine? And it's like we already know these things, and we already know that we're eating these things. But where you can get scared is when a new phenomenon is associated with the use of some of these technologies. Hence, the importance of complete transparency about what we're doing and developing on research, and complete transparency about the regulatory process. So, for example, you should try looking up the environmental and human health implications of the Aqua Bounty salmon that were thoroughly investigated by government agencies, but try finding it on the government websites now. And we have to be front and center about these things. I think as scientists and society, we should be delighted if there's some regulatory oversight of some of our technologies. And I know some of my livestock science colleagues would say, no, we don't need any regulation of the use of gene editing to get rid of a disease in pigs, for example. But yeah, I think the public takes comfort in the fact that somebody is looking at that, and somebody, quotes unquote, objective and trusted, is looking at things before they enter the marketplace. They may never read the label. They may never look up the documents that I suggested about the Aqua Bounty salmon, but they take a lot of comfort in knowing that it's there, which implies more work for regulators, more work for scientists, more work for farmers to try and communicate this message. And I know that every one of those people is busy, crazy busy in complex environments. And so adding this to their day jobs is very difficult. But we've got to continually try and refine this process of transparency around why we're doing the research, what the benefits could potentially be, and what the trade-offs are if we don't.
That's great, but it sounds like you're reasonably optimistic that transparency and oversight actually creates a greater trust with the public that in the end benefits all of us because of the adoption and ability to actually.
I do. I must admit my beliefs were a bit shaken by some of the responses to the COVID vaccines, but I think it was all coming at us way too fast, and we didn't have time to build the bridges that we needed to make people feel comforted. I mean, most people have some memory of vaccines taking 30 years to develop. So right. The whole concept of developing it in a few months seemed terrifying. Yeah. But yeah. we need to keep addressing this issue so that it doesn't happen the next time.
Yeah, really appreciate that perspective. And it aligns with, we did some recent work at Genome Canada as well, and not in the same depth, of course, as the work you've done, but it aligns with public work we did that found that actually the more precise you get with questions in terms of specific applications, the more comfortable people are. That theoretically may be sort of unsure, but then once you start to actually ask about environmental benefits, health benefits, and so on, people are readier to sort of see the cost-benefit analysis in a positive light. So super interesting. Chris, what's your perspective on kind of the public engagement side and maybe kind of it's that relationship with regulation that Ellen just talked about?
Yeah, I would say what was the public's relationship with genomics prior to the pandemic and now after the pandemic, I think are two different aspects of that, because essentially you couldn't turn on the news for 2 years without the term PCR test and variant at front and center for everyone in the public. So I do think that we have given a relatively fast, short course in genetic technologies, as sort of Ellen alluded to, that we maybe have thrust it onto the public. And I know talking with friends and colleagues that aren't in the profession, they may have had enough of the term PCR test and variant for a little bit. But I think that also opens the door and the opportunity to make really wonderful analogies within the agricultural sector. And so kind of using that as a bit of a segue into, okay, here's what's happening on the human healthcare side. But guess what? We've been doing this kind of technology and testing in agriculture for 25 years. And so I think that's a way to open that conversation in a way with an icebreaker that's not too heavy and that it, brings people into that conversation. I'd also say that the public on one side, maybe has some apprehension about genomic technologies, especially genetic engineering, but then they're also curious because you see companies like 23andMe where people, spit in a tube and want to find out a little bit about themselves. So I think there's both sides, and it's really up to us as scientists or industry or those that run companies to still push forward the education and explain where those key differences lie between, let's say, hardcore genetic engineering versus using genomic technologies, let's say for general genotyping, and how those different technologies are being used in different food systems. And I know François will be near and dear to this. It's not always just about gene editing. We've been using DNA markers in plant breeding and animal breeding for decades, and now genomic selection has come on the scene. So these elements have nothing to do with genetic engineering per se, but hold tremendous potential. And we just need to make sure that the public understands these key differences.
Yeah, that's a great observation, Chris. And I think you're exactly right about this crash course everybody got in genomics and genetics during COVID. And I think it's actually the first time my mom actually understood what it is that I do at Genome Canada, getting a chance to read about it in the Globe Mail or whatever. So this is really great. A couple of questions maybe now about kind of Canada and looking outwards a little bit. So thinking about, it's been alluded to by each of you in different ways, kind of the integrated nature of our food systems, both in terms of kind of the vertical supply chain, but also just kind of geographically, the various pieces moving across borders and so on. I guess maybe kind of a bit of a two-part question. The first is really about how do we get kind of stakeholders to work more efficiently together in those supply chains? Are there ideas there, thinking about it from producers, maybe even small scale producers, up through distributors, processors, multinationals at different steps? But then also, where are the opportunities for Canada? Where could we actually see ourselves kind of playing a bit of a kind of a global leadership role when it comes to sustainable agriculture? So maybe kind of we can tackle those in turn. The first is maybe how to better integrate the various pieces in the supply chain. Anyone have any thoughts on this they want to kick off with?
I can start if you like. Sometimes some of the multinational firms, which are pretty dominant in many of the agri-food sectors now globally, are actually driving some of that behavior. So you see that a company may be looking for a particular kind of farmer behavior, and they're dominated by their presence in, say, the United States. But they're not only dealing with United States farmers around these issues, they're also dealing with farmers in Canada and some of the other countries that they work in, generating interest on the part of farmers about doing things in a different way, and also generating interest on the part of farmers and other competitive players in the supply chain to look at ways we could change how we do things in Canada. So in some senses, the multinational nature of our supply chains can help feed commonality across countries in examining which things work and which things won't work. Not at the very tiny level that François was talking about, where we need to target to particular weather, climate, soil type, all of those kind of things. There will still be that variability, but in the main, we know what incentives will drive behavior, and we know what research outcomes are particularly attractive to farmers, to processors, to retailers. So some of that will go on, but the issue of intellectual property sometimes drives challenges in making people work together. And this could be along a supply chain. This could be across supply chains, because there's some ways that we can apply technologies in different contexts. And people may want to capture the intellectual property right in one supply chain for economic benefits. So the whole issue of intellectual property rights is part of what encourages investment, what encourages multinationals to invest in research in different countries and contexts. And I think it remains a bit challenging, because without intellectual property rights, sometimes there's no economic agenda for some players to participate.
Right. And so so you're saying that, we think that actually perhaps strengthening of intellectual property rights is potentially an avenue for exploration?
Distributing intellectual property rights, maybe between the public
Right.
and private sector, is something that I think remains challenging, that is important to continue looking at.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks, Ellen. Francois, did you want to pick up on any of that?
Well, I think that Ellen really hit the nail there with that intellectual property, because that's certainly been in some areas a limiting factor. I think one of the areas where I think Canada has really created an opportunity for itself is in the research ecosystem that for years has been very nurturing of relationships being established, collaborations between different stakeholders and the research funding. So I think that's a great strength and a great success story, but it only feeds a certain type of research. And I think if we want to have an impact on a broader scale, and especially in the sustainable agriculture area, I think we have to diversify our research funding models to be more inclusive of some other aims and objectives. And what has served us very well for certain areas of research is not necessarily what will best suit other types of aims. And so I think if there's an opportunity that needs to be sort of investigated in the Canadian system, it'd be more geared towards that, in my view.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Chris, how about you? You're a player within these global supply chains. Where do you see the opportunities and challenges?
Yeah, I see, Canada being a leader in not only the development, the research, but application of precision agriculture technologies as a large umbrella term, whether that's genomics or precision phenotyping systems or blockchain technology for traceability within the food system. I think we're really poised, maybe taking on what Francois had said, that diversification of funding across the entirety of the food chain system, and having that research zeroed in on all these different elements, which we have tremendous research ecosystems, talent, but we just need to make sure that we can execute across those different areas where we can be leaders in, again, whether that's robotics in the greenhouse sector, artificial intelligence. We have the means to be leaders in a number of different areas. It just has to be, I think, communicated better, more strategic vision on how we want to integrate these technologies, within the food system, and identifying the differences in the food system depending on where you are geographically within the country. If you're Western Canada and you're more vertical in your farming, or here in Ontario where there's a bit more diversification of the ag industry, or you're out in the maritime provinces and you're talking about fisheries. So I think that the sort of matching that technology to what is being defined as your food system geographically is really important.
Yeah.
Could I say one thing? Being in Western Canada, it's been fascinating, having worked on livestock projects for a long time and sort of secretly really liking cattle. I've been fascinated by the challenges that have been coming forth in Western Canada around the plant-based protein versus the animal-based protein. And is animal agriculture bad because of methane emissions and plants are going to be better? But it turns out that animals are pretty essential for maintaining grasslands, because we need the grasslands to be grazed or we're going to lose them. And these challenges playing out in Western Canada in terms of what we support suggests that we do need a range of funding models to make sure that these things happen. And we need to identify, as François has said before, the public good aspects of this research versus some of the private gains that can be made, and make sure that we're not prioritizing the same types of projects all the time. Just because it may not have a commercializable element, we have to focus on the public good aspects. I'd hate to see Western grasslands disappear if we focused on reducing the number of cattle that were grazed without having properly done the research to see what the ecosystem benefits are from grazing those cattle on grasslands in the West, for example.
Yeah, that's a great example of a role for public good research, Ellen. I appreciate that. François, did you want us to get anything else in here, maybe on areas where Canada has an opportunity for kind of global leadership?
Well, I think there's certainly, some areas where, because of the small population that we have and the large land mass, and for a large segment of the country, I think we have fairly generous water supplies. I think a lot of countries would be quite jealous to have the amounts of water that we have. I think that there has to be maybe some leadership in how we use that water, and maybe become better stewards, not necessarily because a drop saved here will be more available there, but I think it's part of the maybe a global view of how some of these shared resources can be better managed, I guess, with durability in mind.
Yeah, great perspective. Great perspective. We're coming kind of towards the end here, which is too bad because I feel like we're really just hitting our groove. But we've explored a lot of ground. Maybe we could do one last round here, and just I'll ask you to maybe briefly, if you could maybe identify from all that's been discussed here, kind of one kind of pet idea, one action that you would suggest that Canadian stakeholders in sustainable agriculture really could take to ensure that we're advancing around innovation in genomics or elsewise to become a global leader. So this is kind of your pitch, your chance for the one big idea. Chris, maybe we'll start with you.
Okay. I don't know if it's one big idea or many, many small ideas, but I think we've hinted at it throughout this conversation that we just need to make sure we're always listening to the public and those that are actually in the different areas along a food production system, and that we understand and identify those challenges along a food system to ensure that it maintains its sustainability, and that we're directing our resources in the most efficient way that we can have the largest impact on not only making sure that food systems are sustainable, but they also thrive, and that we are globally competitive on that stage as well.
Awesome. Love it. Ellen, how about you?
Well, I'm going to make a small point. I think if you put 100 Canadians in a room, some scientists, some government people, some people who work at Loblaws, for example, and people from the street, and ask them what sustainability meant, you would have dramatically different answers. And I think it's important that somehow or other we come to a common definition of sustainability that, appropriately incorporates the aspects that are important, that we all agree on. Because right now we're not all working towards exactly the same goal, or we're not understanding what the goal actually is. And I can't stress enough that we need to ensure, as Chris said, that the public is engaged in this definition of sustainability and understands it. I don't know who the player is to determine that, but if we could, if somebody other than me could do research in 10 years and everybody defines sustainability in the same way, I would think that we would be far faster in accepting technology, accepting new products, and moving forward to protect our resource base and use it to feed people globally.
Yeah, that's great. And certainly if you can get everyone pulling in the same direction, it's a lot easier to get movement. François, how about you?
Yeah, similar. I think I'd really, focus on building trust and dialogue, because I think, dialogue is essential to sort of converge on common definitions of what are the goals we're trying to achieve, and having trust in our regulatory system and in the good faith of different actors. We saw in the COVID situation, I think that public trust in scientists in general was quite high, and we need to build on that to help us deal with the different challenges that are before us.
Yeah, that's a great perspective and a nice way to end this. I'm really encouraged. I think that the commonality between your sort of three visions here, all of them have to do with really kind of engagement with the public and with societal issues and ensuring that there's alignment. In some ways, it speaks to me about the justifiable optimism about the actual technology. It's pretty amazing what we can do. And we have, I certainly have a fair degree of optimism that technology can contribute in a really positive way to solving some of our big challenges. But the real effort and the real maybe difficulty will be kind of how that plays out on implementation. We didn't talk about issues around equity and equitable access to some of these technologies as well. But that social side of things, I think, is going to be absolutely crucial. And it came through very clearly through all of your comments. So I thank you. That is it. We've hit the time here. I want to first thank our panelists sincerely for making the time today to share your expertise, your perspectives, your experience, your thoughts. Thank you to all the viewers and listeners who've made time in your days to listen in to this really interesting conversation. This topic is certainly very, very timely. It's obviously right now it's of great importance as we think about how we leverage these new technologies and innovations to address important issues around food security, climate, and so on. So we at Genome Canada remain committed to working with researchers and companies, but also the public in the development of these tools and the deployment of them in order to kind of help improve the situation, not just here in Canada, but around the world. So just as a follow-up, I invite everyone to come check out the Genome Canada website, connect with us on social media, and we will look forward to doing this again another time. Have a great day.